for the sync between the sounds. Okay.
I just want to say something to the camera.
Yeah.
It is the 12th of December, 2014. We are here with Harold Smoky Symon for an interview about his life as an Air Force pilot, well, his life as a whole, and here in his house in Herzliya Pituach, and we will now conduct the interview. Oh, I didn't give my name. You're on? I don't see red. I saw red before. I don't see red now.
It's okay.
Okay. Oh, there it is. I saw. Oh, sorry. Forgot to say my name, Elli Wohlgelernter. Thank you for being with us today. Thumbs off.
Yes.
So we'll start at the beginning, if I'm not mistaken. You're born April 24th, 1920?
Correct.
Tell me about, first, your parents, your grandparents, where they came from, how they got to South Africa, a little bit of history of your generations.
My grandparents came originally from Russia
Which
to
side?
England.
Which side? Which side?
Which side of Russia?
Which grandparents, maternal or paternal?
My maternal grandparents came from Russia, settled in England, subsequently immigrated to South Africa. On my late father's side, his family grew up in Lithuania. My mother was just a small child when the family arrived in England, and they settled in Cape Town in South Africa. And really they were merged into the South African scene, like so many of the other immigrants who came out from Europe. And we were, in my own family, we were 4 children. I was the youngest of 4. My 3 older siblings have passed away. So I'm really the sole remainder of the direct family connection. And I really grew up in the Orange Free State, which was one of the 4 provinces in South Africa at the time. And I really grew up in 2 very small villages, both of which were predominantly Afrikaans. But at home we spoke English, but the general community was really predominantly Afrikaans speaking. I finished school in a town called Winburg, and from there went on to Johannesburg, and I had 4 years at university. I did my Bachelor of Commerce degree and Chartered Accountant degree. When I finished writing my final exam in December 1940, I volunteered to serve in the South African forces in the war against Nazi Germany. You may know that South Africa didn't have compulsory service in those days because of the political divide in the country between the South African Party and the Nationalist Party. And I joined the South African Air Force. I was trained as a navigator bombardier. I did my training in South Africa, and I did my operational training in Kenya. And then I joined a squadron which was really part of the Desert Air Force in North Africa.
Okay, hold it right there. I want to go back a little bit. We'll come back to the Desert Air Force. Your parents, what did they do?
My dad was a shopkeeper. He ran a general dealer's store, as it was referred to in those days. Yeah.
What was the Jewish life that you had as a child in your home?
Really, it was a very small Jewish community. I think at most there were about 29 Jewish families in this town. We actually had a reverend, as we called him, rather than a rabbi. And I had a bar mitzvah. And it was a small but very close Jewish community. We tried to set up a rugby team and a cricket team amongst the Jewish youngsters, but we didn't have sufficient numbers, so we incorporated a number of our non-Jewish friends and we called ourselves the Yokis Burkis Mixed, which meant the Jewish, non-Jewish mixed team. And it was the relationships with the non-Jewish community generally were very good.
Did you have any experiences of anti-Semitism?
Very little. The community, the non-Jewish community, were very friendly and towards the Jewish community. And the first experiences that I really became aware of in regard to anti-Semitism was when German Jews left Germany in the 1930s and came out to South Africa. And when one heard of the horrific stories of anti-Semitism in Germany, it sort of brought home to us that this was really a horrific phenomenon. And but as I said, we as a community, we really weren't exposed to anti-Semitism.
How would you describe religious observance in your home as a child?
We weren't really Orthodox in a way. We were really traditional. We used to have Kiddush on Shabbat, and we went to Cheder, and I suppose you might say that we were just a community which we didn't have any schisms between us, Reform and Orthodox and that sort of thing. I suppose one might say it was really nominally an Orthodox community, but we weren't extremely observant about the...
Was that true for the whole community? Being such a small community, everyone was more or less the same kind?
Yeah. It really was a very homogeneous community, really.
Did you have Jewish girlfriends in high school?
No, there were very few Jewish girls really of our age. And our friends were really mainly Afrikaans speaking friends. Really.
How did you view the situation of black and white in South Africa in that time?
At that time, when going back to my school day years, and that really means in the 1930s, The white-black relationship in our little town was a very peaceful one. You never had any political problems or protests and so forth. And the blacks especially were treated respectfully by the Jewish community, more so than by the non-Jewish community. But we had our sort of feelings of sympathy and respect for them, and they really were part of our households, actually, you know. Oh, they brought up the kids and so on.
And when you hear about what was going on in the rest of the country, in the relationships between, or the situation, the life of South Africa between the whites and the blacks, and where there were confrontations or demonstrations.
Oh yes, very much so.
Yes.
Yeah, because the especially when the Nationalist Party, who were really the more extreme sector of the white population, they really discriminated against the blacks. They really treated them as inferior human beings. And that was, you know, really the general level of relationships between white and black. There was certainly tremendous discrimination, you know, as far as facilities were concerned. And for example, if you saw a bench in a park, it said for whites only. And it was more or less like the problems they had in America as well. The buses were for the whites and the buses for the blacks. And so there was certainly rigorous discrimination.
How old were you when you became aware of it, and what were your feelings?
Well, until I matriculated, until I finished school, I lived in that sort of clannish environment. And then I went up to Johannesburg to study. And there, of course, you became very much aware of the discrimination and the differences and so forth. And frankly, we were, you know, I wouldn't say that we were outraged by it. We were uncomfortable with the situation. But
were you the whites? Were you the Jews? Were you the friendship, the gang that you were with?
Yeah, I would say in our circles, we really we were very uncomfortable about the situation, and I wouldn't have said that I would have emigrated from Israel from South Africa at that time because of the political environment. Our life, or my life, really took a different direction because of the trouble after World War II that was brewing in the Middle East. I was away for 5 years during the war, from January 1941 to the end of 1945. And like all other servicemen, we were trying to rehabilitate ourselves after the war. And then, of course, we saw the war clouds gathering over Palestine, the Middle East, and that really changed the whole course of my life.
When you were growing up, what were your dreams to become?
I had no special program in mind. I suppose I was quite serious in my approach to life, but I never envisaged that I'm going to be a professor or a great person. I just wanted to grow up, have a profession, earn a living, have a family, and there was really nothing special or extraordinary about my ambitions at the time. And as I said, the development which really brought about the whole change of direction of my life was when, after the United Nations Declaration in November 1947, and it seemed inevitable because I got out of the, I was discharged from the Air Force at the end of 1945. So it was very close to the, it was just 2 years before the United Nations partition plan. And then the Jewish community, particularly, we really started recruiting and planning how were we going to be able to help Israel.
Let me back up a little bit. When you finished school in December 1940 and joined the South African Air Force, what made you join the South African Air Force? As opposed to the Army or some other part of the war effort?
I joined the Air Force because my hatred of the Germans. That was really my motivation. When I'd heard from these refugees who had come out from Germany of what really had occurred over there, I just felt as a Jew that they were, once war was declared, that I was absolutely motivated to sort of fight the German monsters, and that was really my motivation.
Was that the feeling among the entire South African Jewish community? Everyone wanted to do something for the war effort?
I would say that about 5% of the South African Jewish community volunteered to serve, because they were all volunteers. There was no conscription. And at the time, I would say there were about 120,000 Jews in South Africa, men, women, and children.
The whole of South Africa?
The whole of South Africa. Mm-hmm. And about 5% of the total Jewish population were served in the South African forces.
Were you not afraid that you were going off to war, that you could be killed?
I wouldn't say I was afraid. You were, of course, aware of the fact that you may not survive the war. And happily, I mean, I served in many theaters of the war during my 5 years. And thank God, I emerged alive and unhurt. And but of course, the risk was a permanent risk of either death or injury.
What was your scariest moment during the war?
It's difficult to say your scariest moment. You know, when you were flying, and you just see a barrage of anti-aircraft missiles coming up. Are we going to make it? You know, and but I must say that I had a feeling that I was going to survive the war. There were many guys who had a different feeling. You know, you had guys who go to bed at night and say, "Please God, don't let us fly tomorrow." And I never had that feeling of an intense feeling of fear.
Where did that come from?
I don't know. I think it was just my attitude. I felt, you know, it's a job, and we're it's us against them. And our objective was to kill as many as we could of their side, and they similarly had the same motivations. But, you know, when one considers yourself to be so fortunate and to be so grateful that you actually emerge out of 5 years of war, you know, and
Certainly.
come out of it intact is what greater blessing could one ask for, in fact.
Correct, but going into it, you're up against, it's Russian roulette.
Yeah, of course, it's the unknown, sure.
What did your parents say?
Well, my father had passed away, and when I put it to my mother that this was the way I felt, of course, she was very much concerned. But she didn't say, I don't want you to go. She never created an obstacle for me. And it was the same thing when I told her that we're going to fight in Israel.
Because she trusted your decision, or because she knew she couldn't dissuade you?
Perhaps it was a combination of both. You know, the natural fear of a mother, but knowing that, you know, the guy he's mature, he's grown up, and he's taken a conscious decision. And I mean, the cause, nobody could quarrel with the cause for which we were joining up. And she really accepted it. But you know, when I was away, I kept close touch with letters and so forth. And then, of course, after World War II, the question of the conflict in the Middle East arose.
We'll get to that in a second. What did your siblings do during the war?
Well, I had two sisters and one brother, and he was actually, he was a civilian, but he served in the Defense Administration. He was an accountant within the Defense Forces. But he never went abroad with a fighting unit.
And he had volunteered before you, of course. He was older.
Yeah, actually, that's right. He went in before I did.
Because my next question was going to be, did you feel motivated to follow your older brother?
Yeah. No, I felt that I would really, I had such an intense hatred of the Germans for what they had done, that I, you know, whatever I could do to damage them, I was ready to.
When you were at school, in college, university, just before you finished and joined the Air Force, in discussions with your friends, how would they relate to what they were hearing as well as what you were hearing about what was going on back in Germany to the Jews?
Well, you know, I tell you, really we were studying and we were working. I was serving my articles and I was studying at university and so forth. And a number of my peers maybe didn't feel as strongly as I did. I happened, as a result of my job, being apprenticed to a firm of auditors, I came across a lot of the German refugees, perhaps more than most of my peers at the time. So I was really moved and motivated and influenced by what I had. I liked a lot of the people that I had met, and when one heard the atrocious stories, you know, one develops your own sensations and thoughts and psychology and so forth.
You mentioned before about the Afrikaans, speaking Afrikaans, and you speaking English at home, but you obviously you learned Afrikaans from a young age and English from a young age, correct?
Yeah.
And did you learn Hebrew at the Cheder? So well?
Yeah, that was really, it was really very primitive Hebrew, you know, just really preparing for your bar mitzvah and so forth. And but my Afrikaans was really very fluent. It was, I suppose, as good as my English. At home, we spoke English.
Did you get newspapers at home?
Yeah, at home we got English newspapers, yeah.
Tell me a little bit about the war, Second World War, your service in the South African Air Force.
I was posted to a squadron in the Middle East in June 1942, after my training period was over. And you know, in really it's common practice in the Air Forces, after you get your wings, you really go through an operational training school, and which I did in Kenya. That's where the operation training school was. And then I was posted to a South African squadron, which was part of the Desert Air Force.
What did you find difficult in learning to become a pilot?
Well, I didn't train as a pilot, I trained as a navigator bombardier. And the training was fine. It really went well.
The navigator bombardier sits alongside the pilot?
That's right.
And
not necessarily alongside, we were in the
cockpit.
In our aircraft, we were in the nose of the aircraft because you had your bomb sight there and so forth, you know.
And what was your specific job as a navigator? What did you specifically have to do?
Yeah, you had to get the pilot to the bombing scene, and then you were responsible for dropping the bombs. You were really directing him, you know, turn left, turn right, drop your altitude, and open the bomb doors. And
you would tell him, you wouldn't open the bomb door, you would tell him to open the bomb door.
Yeah, I tell him to open the bomb doors, that's right, yeah.
Were you good at it?
I was good at it because I became a lead navigator bombardier as well.
What is that?
You know, where you lead, say, 12 aircraft or 18 aircraft. Sometimes a whole wing would go out, and that would be 36 aircraft. So, yeah, I was quite successful as a navigator bombardier.
Your officers.
Where did you go?
Your officers were. Did you advance in rank? Your officers commended you specifically. You were considered an ace at your job?
I wouldn't say that. I was, you know, just a solid navigator bombardier. And then, of course, the climax, or the earliest climax, really came about at the Battle of El Alamein, which was in October 1942, which actually was the first real victory of the Allies in World War II. You know, up to then, the Russians were suffering terrible losses, and the Allies in Europe certainly weren't doing well either. And El Alamein was really quite a turning point in the war. And from there, you know, we were just harassing the Germans day and night. And we had two very great commanders. There was General Montgomery, who was in charge of the land forces, and Air Marshal Tedder, who was the guy in charge of all the air activity. And it was very interesting. Before the Battle of Alamein, they came round to all the squadrons and they gave a general briefing, what the plans were and so forth. They really took the air crews into their confidence, and, you know, made them feel that we really got a solid plan, because Churchill was putting a lot of pressure on Montgomery to open up the the desert campaign after losses that they had sustained in the desert. And Montgomery took a very firm stand. He said, I'm not going to open the front until I'm ready. But when I'm ready, I'm going to drive the Germans out of North Africa. Because they were hoping via Egypt to get through to the Middle East and to augment their oil supplies. And that was really their game plan. And it was very interesting how the battle proceeded from Egypt into Libya and into Tunisia and into Malta and into Sicily and into Italy. And, you know, it was a lot of activity. And
how many different countries were part of the squadron in LMA?
Now, then I come to an interesting point. One of the British squadrons had a lot of losses. And they asked the South African Air Force if some of their experienced aircrew would become seconded to the British, not to join the RAF, but to be attached to the Royal Air Force. And I was one of the guys who was asked, to which I agreed.
Because?
I thought it would be very interesting, because there you had British, Canadian, Australian, South African air crews. And I thought it would be an interesting experience getting to know these guys from all these different countries. So I had about 9 months with the British until I finished my tour of operations, actually.
What did you learn from the British?
You know, we were actually in a position where we were able to teach them a bit. The South Africans, we had an excellent Air Force. The training was very good, and the morale and the spirit was very good. And we got along well together with these guys. It was very interesting having Canadians and Australians and Brits and South Africans in that particular wing in which I served. And then I finished my tour of operations, and I then really hoped to be posted to England on heavy bombers, which were really going to be the main thrust against the Germans in Germany.
Let me ask you a couple of specifics. How many bombing raids did you go on?
I had about 35 bombing raids.
In how many countries?
During that period. Then my second tour of operations, as I said, I'd hoped to be posted to England onto heavy bombers. But South Africa had then set up another command called Coastal Command. Because, you know, the losses from the German U-boats were horrendous. They were torpedoing the Allied ships. And so South Africa then set up its Coastal Command, and it was new, and I was posted to that particular command. And there it was a case of escorting convoys of ships and hunting German submarines and naval reconnaissance in the Atlantic and the Indian Oceans. And then after Germany surrendered in May 1945, there was still the war against Japan. And our squadron, we were really all packed up to go to Japan, but in August, of course, the atomic bombs were dropped, and that was the end of the story. And then I was discharged a couple of months after that episode.
Can you name me a few places that you took, that you did go on bombing raids? Where specifically did you bomb?
Your question?
How many different countries or places that you went on bombing raids?
Well, it was as part of the Desert Air Force, our job was really mainly getting the Germans out of North Africa. And so there was Egypt and Libya and Tunisia, and then the Mediterranean, Malta, and then Sicily, and then Italy. And at that stage, I had finished my tour of operations. You then got home leave. Then I had to do another course to prepare for service in Coastal Command, which I did in South Africa. And then I finished off actually in the UK. We were based in Scotland and Ireland for a couple of months, and then we were shipped out to the Atlantic, the Indian Oceans, and up to India and so forth.
How many different kinds of planes did you fly in?
Well, the bombers that I served were called Baltimore bombers. And in Coastal Command, we had Catalina. In Coastal Command, you really have aircraft that land on the sea as well, you know, either on land or on sea. And there we flew in Catalinas, which was an American aircraft, and the Sunderlands, which were British aircraft. And on the Sunderlands, we used to do up to 12-hour flights. So you really had a slip crew. You had two crews. And you do half, and then the other guy takes over from you, because we used to do very long trips out at sea. And really it was an extremely interesting experience going through World War II. And of course, we never dreamt that when we were discharged that the war clouds were starting to gather over Palestine.
Of the planes you flew in, which ones did you love the most? Which ones did you hate the most?
Actually, you know, I was very happy in the planes in which we flew. You know, you felt confident about the planes. You know, good engines and good airframe structures and so forth, and the mechanics were extremely good on servicing the aircraft, and so I had no particular preference.
Was it hard to learn so many different planes?
Not really, because you know your training was always intense. Your training is strict training. It's the Israel Air Force is of course superb in that respect. I mean the training, because both my sons were fighter pilots in the Israel Air Force, and and now I've got a guy who's just married one of my granddaughters, who's a pilot in the Air Force, and then I have a grandson who was a pilot in the Air Force. The training here is superb. That's why you have the United States Air Force loving to fly with our chaps on training exercises, and the Romanians and the Italians and the Greeks and up to quite recently the Turks. They all used to them it was outstanding experience flying with the Israeli Air Force guys, because here it is so intense. The training is absolutely superb. It's and that is, you know, one feeling that I'll certainly enjoy for the rest of my days was the experience I had in the Israeli Air Force.
We're coming to that now. The guys you served with during the Second World War, you remained friends with them for life?
You know, what happened was that once I got involved with Israel, I really lost contact with most of those guys.
Did you have a feeling when you were with those guys and you're flying together in the Second World War, the sense of mission, the sense of importance, the sense of the noble venture that you were embarked on, that this was important for the history of the world. Did you have that sense?
Yeah, I had the sense that it was so important from the Jewish aspect, that the Jews are contributing. You know, when in a number of the lectures I've given, I've told the audience how many Jews are aware that there were 1.5 million Jews who served during World War II. The Russians 500,000. United States 550,000. The British Empire, the Free French, the Free Polish, the Underground, Warsaw Ghetto. It's 1.5 million Jews. On a somber note, one of the great pities is that there were only 4,800 Machelniks who came to fight in the War of Independence. When you think of the numbers of Jews who had acquired real war experience, and they didn't come, and history is never forgiven us, and that's why we've got a West Bank problem and an East Jerusalem problem. If there had been, we were 4,800 Machelniks. If there had been 15,000, we wouldn't have those intractable problems today.
Let me ask you last question on the war. When you were flying over these different North African countries and other countries, but when you were bombing the Germans, what did you see below when you were bombing them? On the ground, what did you see?
Well, you know, there you're seeing tanks, and you're seeing artillery, and you're seeing troops, and the different targets that you're really attacking. So it really depends on what the particular targets of the day were, you know.
And when you see it hit and explode, you have that sense of, yes, we did it.
Yeah, but you see, you're also very glad to be off the scene, to do your bombing run and to get out of it, because they've got their fighters, their combat aircraft, and they've got their anti-aircraft. So you just want to get out of the firing zone, as it were, as quickly as possible. You know, you just want to get home safely.
Did you ever have a plane hit that you were in?
Yeah.
How many times?
You know, I wonder how many times that would be. Not often. I would think perhaps 6 or 7 times, because you see what happened with the...
You call that not often.
The Germans, they you know, you had to fly through a barrage of anti-aircraft. They know you're coming. Their radars picked you up. It's given them advance notice that an attack is on its way. You try to digress, and as though you're going to another target, and at the last minute you're switching to your primary target. And then they just put up a barrage, and you're just damn lucky if you can get through. And, you know, when you think some guys on their very first raid get killed, it's the fate, the luck of the draw, you know. Yeah.
Did you not have a sense that you were flying in such a situation that you're on a suicide mission?
No, I wouldn't say that. You knew that there is a serious risk. But as I said, I had a feeling that I'm going to make it. I'm really going to come out of this as alive and beseda, as we say.
What did you write back to your mother?
Well, you know, I always wrote back encouraging news that it's interesting, and we're meeting nice guys, and I'll be home for my long leave in a couple of months' time, or 6 months' time, or 9 months' time. And
but you would never describe battle to her? You would not describe battles?
No. The main thing is I'm safe and I'm well, and we're in good spirits and so forth, you know. Yeah.
Okay, the war's over, and now you're discharged in November of 45. You started a small practice in Johannesburg as an accountant and auditor.
Right.
How was business?
Well, I was a newbie, you know. I just started up, and I got a number of small clients, friends of mine, so on. One company afterwards became a very successful public traded company, Commercial Air Services, which was started by pilots who served in World War II, and I was appointed their auditor, and that really gave me quite a nice start, actually. But actually, I was really only in civilian life from the end of 1945, and then I was in the Air Force here from May 48.
Where were you November 29th, 1947?
29th of November 1900, in Johannesburg. Yeah, that was after World War II. And yeah, that's...
Did you listen to the vote on the radio?
Yeah.
Did you keep score?
I think everybody was really keeping score, you know, of how the vote was going. Yeah. And then, of course, following that, it became so evident that there was going to be a showdown in the middle.
How did South Africa vote?
How did South Africa vote? I think for Israel. Yeah.
You were with other Jewish friends that day in school. At work. I mean, what was the atmosphere? What did you celebrate? What did you do?
Yeah, we were celebrated, and at the same time you realized there's going to be very challenging times ahead. So it wasn't just a matter of joy. There was mixed feeling, and especially for people who had served in the armed forces before, you know, that what's going to happen over there? And but I must say, the South African community, the Jewish community, rallied very well. Interestingly enough, the South African had the biggest single contribution. We were 834 mechanics who came from South Africa, and I'm not saying this in any disparaging way. There were 807 Americans, but the main reason why the American they had a problem which we didn't have in South Africa, and that was the risk of losing your citizenship. And many American ex-servicemen were really very worried about that. Whereas in South Africa, they knew we were coming to fight. We actually came over on student visas that we were going to, because my wife and I, we came over together. She had served in the South African Air Force as well. And so both, when we decided we were going to Israel, to Palestine really, South Africa really, we came on student visas that we were going to study. But the South African government knew exactly what was happening, and they really closed an eye to the situation. So we didn't feel that risk that we may lose our citizenship.
Between November 47 and May of 48, how did the idea start to crystallize in your head that, okay, I've had the experience, they're going to need me, I should go over there and help? How did you get there?
You know, the deciding factor was really the Jewish nation is at risk. And we had an active ex-servicemen's service in a league in South Africa. And so...
Jewish or just general?
Jewish. There was general and there was Jewish, the Jewish Ex-Servicemen's League. And so the Zionist Federation and the synagogues and word of mouth really started operating. And they did an excellent job of recruiting. And I realized I've got to give up my little practice, which I just started. And I approached a friend of mine and told him that I'm going to Israel. Would he mind just looking after my practice so that I'll have some foothold to come back to after the war? Not dreaming, you know, what's going to happen? Are you going to come back alive, or what's going to happen? So we then we were due to have got married later in 1948, but when we weren't married at the time, and I said to my wife, my future wife, I said, you know, we've got to postpone our marriage because I'm going to Israel. And she said, you know, I'm also going to Israel. And so we decided to get married, and we came over together, and we spent our honeymoon in the War of Independence. And that was it. And, you know, needless to say, it was the greatest experience of our lives. It's something which could never, ever recur, incomparable to that. And so that was the start of our Israel experience.
Your siblings also came? They stayed in South Africa?
No, they stayed in South Africa.
So you told them, and your mother, my bride and I are going.
Yeah.
And they all said to you, they were happy, sad?
Worried, yes. I mean, everybody was worried, including ourselves, because we didn't know what we were letting ourselves in for. We had no idea. We just felt that impulse. We've got to contribute whatever we can towards the Jewish state and the Jewish cause. And we arrived in Israel on the 9th of May, and we signed on with the Air Force on the 10th of May.
First, you have a story about the captain wouldn't fly to Israel. He flew only to Cairo, to
That's correct.
Cyprus.
To Cyprus.
Tell me that story.
Yeah. And when we got to Cyprus, it actually took us 6 days before we got to Israel. And what happened was that in Cyprus, which was the last stop on the leg to Palestine, the captain says, "Listen, there's fighting at Lydda airport, and I'm not going to risk the lives of my passengers and the aircraft." And I was supposedly in charge of the group that was going over to Israel at the time. I said, "Look, my friend, you've contracted to get us to Palestine. If you can't take us, you've got to make another plan." And then we had negotiations with the Cypriot airline, and they said, "Okay, we'll fly you, but we won't go to Lydda, we'll fly into Haifa." And that really was quite an experience as well, because when we got to Haifa, the British were evacuating. bearing in mind there were 100,000 British troops in Palestine at the time. And my wife has certain documents on her, which has slipped into her clothing, addressed to Ben Gurion. And we thought, if the Brits are going to search us, we might find ourselves in detention under the Brits. But fortunately they didn't. They were so busy with their own problems, and so we got in okay, and then they took us down by bus to Tel Aviv, and the next day we signed on for the Air Force.
How many people were with you in your group coming from South Africa?
I would say there were about 30 to 35 in our group.
Men and women all your age?
Yeah.
Who had served in the Army or Air Force?
Certainly most of them.
Most?
Yeah.
Some just volunteering as civilians?
Yeah.
Were you concerned about being detained in Cyprus in a detention camp?
No, we you know, that was part of the British naval blockade, which was really arresting the ships and so forth. But we had no connection with that aspect of it at all.
So you now sign up for the Air Force on May 10th, and 4 days later, it was May 14th, the British are leaving. Palestine is about to declare a state. Tell me about that week and that day.
When we signed up, we realized that Israel really doesn't have an air force, which we had anticipated. How could Israel have had an air force under the British mandate? And so the only aircraft we had were light civilian aircraft. A number of them were flown out of South Africa, Fairchild aircraft and a couple of Bonanzas, and Dragon Rapide, which became Israel's first ambulance.
How big were these planes? How many people could fit on them?
The Fairchild, two persons, and the Bonanzas, 3 persons, and the Dragon Rapide, you could have 6 or 7. And in fact, I was responsible for setting up that Dragon Rapide as the Air Force's first hospital plane, with the director of Tel Aviv Hospital at the time. But in any event, when we were sort of taking stock of our position, we have to use these light civil aircraft to fly with the minimal damage that we're capable of doing.
Because there were so few planes.
And there were so few planes, and they could, and they weren't geared for carrying bombs. They didn't have bomb racks and protection and so forth. Nothing. Anyhow, on the 14th of May, Jordan was the first Arab country to attack Israel. That was a Friday, and Ben Gurion was declaring the establishment of the state, and I was with another South African, a good friend of mine, Boris Senior. The army said to us, look guys, we've got to get an estimate of the strength of the Jordanians. They had already penetrated Israel, and we want you to give us a report. So we said, okay, we'll do a reconnaissance. Boris Senior had smuggled this Bonanza aircraft out of South Africa, and he and myself and an Israeli air photographer, we went on the first operational mission of the Israel Air Force. This was on the Friday afternoon, at the very time that Ben Gurion was declaring the state. And we were really shocked when we saw the strength of the Jordanian army, which was then referred to as the Arab Legion. And as you may know, they were led by British officers. And we saw that these armored cars and tanks were nose to tail, trucks and petrol Bowsers and the troops.
How many did you see? How many tanks? How much did you see from the air?
Well, you know, difficult to count, but there must have been hundreds of these different vehicles.
How close to the border?
Well, in fact, they had already crossed the border. When we flew over the Etzion block, the kibbutz was on fire. Subsequently, we learned that they had killed 240 civilians and military personnel.
The day before?
No, that very day.
On the 14th?
Yeah. And they had taken prisoners of war 420. And the kibbutz was on fire. And then we went to army headquarters and reported on what we had seen. And it really was a very somber picture. And then, of course, on the 15th of May, 5 other armies joined the war.
Were there any Jordanian planes?
Were there any Jordanian planes?
No, they weren't. They actually had some Spitfires, which we photographed on the ground. But one took to the air, apparently to see if they could catch us. But we flew into the sun and he had no chance of catching us at that stage.
I just want to back up 3 days. At the beginning of the week, you signed up and you said the Air Force wasn't really an Air Force because they didn't have the capability under the British to form an Air Force.
Yeah.
Who were you reporting to? What was the structure of the Air Force that didn't exist as you were signing up for it?
Yeah. Well, you know, you had Chief of Air Force, whose name was Aaron Remes. He was the son of the First Minister of Transport, David Remes. And you know, they were they were really creating some sort of an establishment.
On the fly?
On the, you know, they took an hotel in our Yarkon Street. It was then known as the Yarkon Hotel. And they evacuated the hotel and said, this will be Air Force headquarters. And so they were starting to set up some of the Israelis who had been in World War II. You had a very interesting situation. The Brits were opposed to Palestinian Jews being trained as pilots. But towards the end of the war, in 1944, there were a number of Palestinian Jews who were being trained as pilots. One fellow whom you might, by the way, like to interview is Dan Tolkovsky. Does that name ring a bell? He was the 3rd Chief of Air Force. But he was also very close to the Machelniks.
Was he Israeli or?
Israeli, yeah, he's Israeli. Sorry to digress about that for the moment, but it just occurred to me now. Mm-hmm. And so we said, listen, whatever we've got, we're going to start using. So we had these few small aircraft. There were Oysters and Fairchilds and Bonanzas. And we had the pilot, and we had what we called the bomb chucker. So I was a bomb chucker. You have your bomb on your knees in the aircraft. The small little aircraft is not terribly steady. and then you have to pull out the pin at the last moment, and the bomb's alive, and then you drop it. That was all we had. We had no combat aircraft at all. The whole question of the imbalance of the Arab forces against the Israeli forces, I mean, was it's hard to describe. But I don't want to digress from what I was telling you. And that's really how we started our first flights with a pilot, with a bomb chucker.
How many were
homemade bombs made by the armorers in Israel, and we were about I suppose then we were only about 10 guys at the beginning who were involved in operational missions.
And that was the beginning of the Air Force, 10
And
guys.
that was the beginning of the Air Force.
Under Remez.
Under Remez, exactly.
Where did you guys sleep?
We slept, we were billeted in hotels. We had a little room in an hotel which still exists in Hayarkon Street, called the Imperial Hotel, small little hotel, and they billeted us in different hotels. We didn't have a camp as such, you know.
For all of 10 guys?
Yeah, no, I mean, absolutely. Not for the 10 guys.
Were you the most experienced of the lot? You were 28, you've been flying for 4 years.
You know, they were really, the earliest guys were really South Africans. Arthur Cooper and Boris Sr. and we were mainly South Africans who were really amongst the very first flyers in the Air Force. And then the mechanics started coming in, but we didn't have the aircraft. And of course, that's another chapter of as I say, the Israel aircraft, Israel Air Force was really unique in two respects. That 95% of the flying crews subsequently were mechanics. And then the Air Force was born in the heat of battle. There was no time to prepare an Air Force. And the other point was that you had these mechanics coming in, and we have no combat aircraft. And that, of course, is really such a critical chapter in this narrative.
What did Remez say to you guys? Fellows, we need to start an Air Force, but we don't have any aircraft, but we're going to be an Air Force anyway.
Yeah, you know, we accepted the reality of the situation. And we realized we had massive problems ahead of us. And the two main challenges for the Air Force were, how do we acquire aircraft, and how do we get them to Israel? You see, all the chips were stacked against us. You had the United Nations embargo on the export of arms to the Middle East, and it affected mainly Israel. The Brits had supplied the Egyptians and the Iraqis and the Jordanians. The French supplied the Syrians and the Lebanese. And here we were totally exposed, no aircraft, no combat aircraft, not a single anti-aircraft gun in the country.
Didn't you turn to Remez and say, but how are we going to do this?
You know, what could you say to Remez? We then just said, now we've got to start organizing how to get aircraft and how to get them to Israel. But the odds were so formidable against Israel. You had the United Nations embargo. You had the American, what's it called? The Sovereignty Act. that you couldn't export any war material from the United States without authorization. And then we had the FBI, and we had the CIA, and we had the British MI6 military intelligence and Scotland Yard, because the Jews were trying to organize and break the embargoes and the United Nations resolution, etc., etc. And then the question was, how do we get the aircraft? How do we acquire them, and how do we get them to Israel? And that really was the two critical challenges which we faced. Then you had a guy like Al Schwimmer, whose name you may be familiar with, who did the most, whom I credit him with having saved the state of Israel, with the aircraft that he smuggled out of the United States, 11 C-46 huge transport aircraft. But I don't know whether you would really like to get involved in that aspect now.
Your specific involvement, I wanted to ask you, by the way, it just occurred to me, what language did Remes speak to you in? You said your Hebrew was rudimentary.
Yeah. Incidentally, English was a language of the Air Force until September 1950. Because all the Machelniks were speaking English, and they were in every department. They were 95% of the air crews, and 95% of the ground crews. And English was the, we actually had air crews from 16 countries, but mainly from the Anglo-Saxon countries. We had, during the war, not all at the same time, but we had 426 flying crews, pilots, navigators, bombardiers, flight engineers, aerial photographers, and so forth. 426. And by the way, there were 92 non-Jews amongst the flying crews. 21% of the flying crews were non-Jewish.
Coming from where?
From the United States, from South Africa, from Sweden, and but mainly from the Anglo-Saxon countries. The United States had the biggest contingent of air crews, 182. South Africa was next with 80. The next was Britain with 60. And the next was Canada with 45. And so on. But they came from 16 countries, actually. France and Hungary and Russia. But English was the language of the aircraft, of the Air Force until September 1950.
What runway were you using as your base?
We used, Tel Aviv was the only base that was free for us at the time. And the Egyptians were bombing. The Egyptians, by the way, had 62 Spitfire aircraft, an iconic aircraft from World War II. And they had a couple of squadrons of the Italian Macchi aircraft. And they were bombing night and day, attacking Tel Aviv and the electric power station and the airfield. It's one attack alone, they killed something like 200 people at the central bus station. As I said, the imbalance of forces was simply unbelievable. They had aircraft, and they had artillery, and they had tanks, and they had personnel. And Israel didn't have a single combat aircraft. We did have 3 tanks which were stolen by deserters when the British were evacuating from Palestine. And but it was really, there was such an imbalance that the United States, the Secretary of State at the time was George Marshall. He said Israel was irresponsible and reckless. We had no right to declare a state. We're going to be overrun within a couple of weeks, and America is not coming to our aid. And the British were convinced within 2 weeks it would be over, and they had been so humiliated with having been forced to give up the mandate. And the Arabs, of course, believe this is going to be a picnic. I mean, the Azam Pasha, who was then Secretary General of the Arab League, says that if the Zionists dare to declare a state, the massacre that we will unleash on them will dwarf what Hitler and Genghis Khan did. You know, that sort of bombastic talk. And on the 15th of May, when they actually attacked, he said this is going to be a war of extermination. He says people will speak of this war like they spoke of the Mongolian wars, you know. And of course the mood in the country was terribly somber at the time. You were being bombed. Every block of apartments was being sandbagged to protect the buildings and so forth. So
you just arrived at the beginning of May, your first time in Palestine.
Actually, you know, I had a week's holiday from the Western Desert and I spent it in Palestine.
When was that?
In 42. Yeah.
Okay. Now you've come again in 48.
Yeah.
What struck you about the country as a place? Meaning, putting aside the war effort for a second, just looking at the country of Israel in 1948. What struck you?
Look, the mood was so somber in the country because the military knew that the odds against us were incalculable. And the civilians, you have a situation of absolute austerity.
Define what that meant.
For example, even the flying crews, you would get a hard-boiled egg and a slice of bread and half a dozen olives for a meal.
Each meal?
Yeah. There was no meat and so forth at all. It was really severe austerity, worse than it was in Britain during World War II.
Weren't you guys losing weight?
I'm sure we must have. I mean, there was really such scanty amounts of food available. But the spirit was a wonderful spirit because everybody felt we're in the same boat. And we've just got to keep that boat afloat as best as we can.
But facing
so
those...
one wasn't really aware of what's happening on the kibbutzim and so forth. Everybody was being conscripted into the army. And but we in the Air Force were really, it was particularly exciting, and because what happened was when Schwimmer, when he smuggled these aircraft, the only way we could get aircraft was to smuggle them. So Schwimmer, he organized 11 C-46 huge transport aircraft, 2 Skymasters, 3 Constellations, 4 B-17 heavy bombers. It was incredible what this guy and his team did.
Coming from where?
From America. And then, because of the FBI and the CIA, he dispersed them all over America. There was an abundance of surplus war material after World War II, everywhere, but you couldn't export. And I mean, and getting those aircraft to Israel, flying them out of the United States down to the Caribbean and to Panama, and then to Brazil, and then across the North Atlantic. Some of them via Morocco, some of them via the Azores Islands, across the Mediterranean, and the one country that really came to our aid was Czechoslovakia. Czechoslovakia saved the state of Israel. And that in itself is an interesting story, because the Russians wanted a foothold in Israel because of oil. The Americans had their contacts. The British had Iraq and Egypt and Jordan with their influence in those countries, and the Russians wanted a foothold, and they thought that the socialists who had come through to Israel and so forth would be sympathetic to their Russian ideology and so forth, but she didn't want to be the breaker of the United Nations decision, the embargo on the Middle East. So she used Czechoslovakia as her front man. But that saved the day for us. And getting these aircraft to Czechoslovakia, and then how to get them from Czechoslovakia to Israel. I mean, the first combat aircraft that the Air Force purchased, and the Mossad really did fantastic work all along the way. There were 25 of what we call the Czechoslovakian Messerschmitts. It was actually the Avea S-199 was the formal name. And so what we did there, we purchased them from the Czechs. Our pilots had, as the Machelniks were really coming through, we sent them to Czechoslovakia.
How?
By air, to be converted onto these aircraft. And there you had one of these tremendous ironies of war. You had Jewish boys who had been flying Spitfires and Mustangs and so forth, now flying a German aircraft with German flying suits and German helmets and swastikas on the body of the aircraft. Unbelievable. And then the aircraft were disassembled in Czechoslovakia, packed into crates, flown over in these huge transport aircraft that Schwimmer had smuggled, reassembled in Israel, and on the 29th of May, when the Egyptians had advanced up to Ashdod, 30 kilometers from Tel Aviv, overrun the kibbutzim fought like lions, but were fighting tanks with hand grenades and rifles, and they came up to Ashdod. And it could only be by the hand of Providence that on the 29th of May, when they got to Ashdod, the Egyptians, our first 4 Messerschmitts became serviceable. And they attacked the Egyptian army with bombs and cannon and guns. And the Egyptians were shocked and destabilized completely, because everybody knew that Israel had no combat aircraft. And the Egyptian Air Force had been bombing and strafing Israel with impunity. And here they suddenly find that there were 4 aircraft attacking them.
And this was done in 2 weeks?
And this was done in 2 weeks, 29th of May. And that's why you may have heard, it's called Ad Halom, up to here. And actually our first target was going to be El Arish Air Base to try and minimize the attacks from the Egyptian Air Force. But the army was absolutely desperate, because if we hadn't stopped them at Ashdod, they would have been in Tel Aviv the next day, and the war would have been over in 2 weeks, no doubt. Jerusalem was under siege, no water, no food, no ammunition. It was absolutely critical. And on that day, and you know, when you talk to Air Force people about it, they can't believe that these aircraft that had not been test flown, they had just been assembled, and their armament systems not tested, and their communication system not tested. They came straight out and went into the battle. And this guy, whose name I mentioned earlier on, Lou Leonard, he was a Marine pilot in the United States Marines. He led, although there were two Israelis on that flight, Asa Weizmann and Modi Alon. They had got their wings in the Royal Air Force during the war. And that war could have been over within 2 weeks.
We're going to hold Hafsaka because it's getting late, and I want to get into your flying missions before you moved up to operations, as well as your involvement in getting these planes and what was going on. We'll do that next time.
Okay.